it's Anthony Chadwick from the Webinar Vet. Thank you so much for coming on the webinar. We've maxed out, so you are the lucky ones. There are some people who are trying to get in and we can't, so apologies if you are listening to this at some stage in the future. I was very fortunate last week, invited down to Vet South, which is a new venture from the Vet Practice magazine. They do Vets North in Manchester, which we're doing again in June. I think I'm going to be speaking at, but I trekked down, thank goodness it was good weather, all the way down to Exeter. And if you're in that neck of the woods, it's well worth considering for next year. In fact, I think somebody came all the way from Cumbria, which was a long way. It was 6 hours for me on the train down to Exeter. As I say, good weather, but a show that's worth looking out for, because I think they will be running it next year. And they'd asked me to talk about demodicosis, coming up with some new ideas on how to treat that. I think I said in the email, it's probably the inquiry I get most often from vets who say, you know, how should we be treating this? We're struggling with this case. How do we deal with it? Hope at the end of it that you'll have some better understanding of the condition, and perhaps some idea of some of these new treatments that are coming out. Very fortunate last summer to go to Croatia. Well worth looking at if you haven't been. Diocletian's palace, of course. Diocletian was a Roman emperor in the 3rd century AD, 300 AD, 4th century AD, and he was a great persecutor of the Christians. And then he died. He retired first to split. His empire was split between 3 other emperors, and he kind of ruled from a distance. He died. He made this huge mausoleum to bury himself in, and then, of course, Constantine won at the Battle of Milvian Bridge and made Christianity an accepted language in the empire. Christians got more power. They dug Diocletian out of his mausoleum, threw him into the sea, as he had thrown many of the Christian martyrs into the sea, and turned his mausoleum into a cathedral. So in the end, he got his comeuppance. But a fantastic place to go to. Dubrovnik, one of the most beautiful cities I've ever visited, and certainly worth looking at. These dogs were all as an exhibition, a photographic exhibition at Liverpool 1 in Liverpool, our big shopping centre. None of them have Demodex, but certainly shampooed up as if maybe they had. So, my objectives tonight: some understanding of the Aetiopathogenesis. We'll talk about the 2 different types of demodicosis. So you have juvenile onset demodicosis and adult onset demodicosis. Talk a little bit about the reason why it's worth looking at and testing for the MDR1 mutation gene. Treatments old and new with my bias, and then prognosis. I know we've had a few webinars done by Tim Nuttall, and he talks a lot about evidence-based medicine, which I think is, you know, absolutely the way that we should be going, and saying that, you know, people's experience and gut feeling is less important. Obviously, I'm not an academic. I am a practitioner. I spent most of my career in first opinion practice doing some dermatology as referrals as a certificate holder. Didn't go to university for my certificate or diploma training. I only have a certificate. And so I have to come to you with my practitioner's training and with the work that I've seen and what's worked and what hasn't. So, you know, it's not an academic's training, but it is what I've seen and what I think works and what doesn't. And then we'll talk a little bit about prognosis too. So the enemy, of course, the main mite that we see is Demodex canis. There is another mite which is quite a pruritic mite. It causes quite a lot of pruritus, called Demodex ingii. And then there's also a mite that lives on the corneal surface, so is not a follicular mite like canis is, and that's Demodex cornei. And you can see the Demodex mites here. We've got some better pictures coming up. And this dog was a dog that I saw with Demodex ingii, presents as a very, very greasy erythematous dorsal pruritus, and these mites can be very, very difficult to treat, and we usually treat these with Aludex. I'm not a big fan of Aludex, as I'll explain later, but I think with these cases then Amitraz seems to be the treatment that works best. But we're not going to be talking a lot about ingi. We're going to be talking about the common Demodex that you will see, which is Demodex canis. So the Demodex life cycle is lasts about 10 or 12 days. Very difficult to grow these in the laboratory, so it's more difficult to really understand fully the life cycle. They are an obligate parasite. They feed mainly on scale and sebum rather than blood. They live in the hair follicles and the sebaceous glands, although of course Demodex cornei lives on the surface. But the Demodex canis mite, which is your common mite, lives in the hair follicles. There are reports, if you look in the literature, of these being occasionally contagious, so dogs have passed them on to other dogs. But of course the major way in which it's transmitted is from the dam to the pup during lactation. So the pup is obviously lactating on the mammary gland, and the Demodex mites come off the mammary gland and spread over the face, which is why we often see Demodex in young dogs as a facial dermatosis at first. Fairly standard life cycle, eggs developing into larvae, into protonymphs, deutonymphs, and then into adults. And I think it's important to have an understanding of the life cycle, because when I am doing skin scrapings, I often want to find what percentages of each part of the life cycle am I finding. So if I'm treating a dog and I'm seeing a few adults but I'm not seeing any eggs, then that's a very good sign that we are beginning to have some success in our treatment. Some more pictures of the mites here. So that is an egg. They can be quite difficult to find. They're not the kind of typical egg that you perhaps look out for, so quite cylindrical. You can see the mites here, and you know, in fact, hair pluckings are a very, very good way of finding mites. So if you scrape and you don't have a success with a scraping, it is well worth considering doing some pluckings as well. And you know, sometimes you may not find them on a plucking, but you'll find them on a scraping. So useful to look at it in both ways, and maybe even tape strips if you're thinking that Demodex cornei may be a possibility. Aetiopathogenesis, fascinating condition. I remember studying this for my certificate. Owen's work goes back to the 70s, as does Scott's work, but still very prescient today. Owen reported that when pups received an anti-lymphocyte serum, so when their lymphocytes were knocked out, generalized demodicosis happened. Scott actually suggested this was a specific T-cell functional defect, and we know that affected dogs have decreased T helper 1 cells, which are involved with cell-mediated immunity, and increased T helper 2 cells, which are more involved in the antibody mediated immunity. There seems to be a defect in interleukin 2. We know that this is a genetic problem. It's a recessive gene. That's why we would recommend spaying or castrating those animals that have demodicosis so they don't pass it on to the next generation. That is, of course, with the juvenile onset demodicosis. In older dogs, this is usually associated with a generalized immunosuppression, which is usually being caused by an underlying disease, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail later on. The breeds that we tend to see are Shar-Peis, and I think Shar-Peis are an interesting breed that we can perhaps talk a little bit about at this point. I will often do biopsies in Shar-Peis fairly early on in my diagnosis, because you can scrape Shar-Peis and thick-skinned dogs like Mastiffs, and you won't find any Demodex mites, so therefore you say, well, this dog doesn't have demodicosis. If you take punches of those, punch biopsies, you will then find the Demodex mites deep in the follicles, and of course you've missed a diagnosis. I think also with Shar-Peis, they're prone to allergy, as you know. They're prone to cutaneous mucinosis. They can get hypothyroidism more commonly than other dogs. And so by doing a biopsy, we're often able to put ourselves at least in the right area. Is this a dog with demodicosis? Is it a dog with cutaneous mucinosis? Is it an allergic dog, pure and simple? Or is it a dog maybe with an hormonal problem? Certainly see quite a lot of demodicosis in West Highland White Terriers as well, but of course it can be seen